Chapter 1. Three Rock Mountain. After open contact occurred between humans and extraterrestrial hybrids, technology was introduced to Earth that proved the existence of parallel realities. As humans and hybrids mingled over time, their offspring exhibited the ability to perceive these alternate realities directly with their natural senses. With further practice and training, our human hybrid ancestors developed this skill into a science that gave rise to the cryptics, nocturnals, shapeshifters, sages and wraiths that exist in our society today, 700 years after the landing. Excerpt from A Hybrid History by Holly Cotton. If time is an illusion, isn't time travel an illusion too? Willa prodded in her soft Irish brogue. Willa Hillychrissing, a slender, blossoming 13-year-old human-alien hybrid, sat on the soft meadow grass, legs crossed. Her larger-than-human butterscotch eyes gazed up at her mentor, Holly Cotton, who was also a descendant of the hybrids that came to Earth in the dimly remembered 21st century. Actually, Willa was staring at the back of Holly's head, which was capped with long, silver-white tresses that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Holly turned away from the nano-glass computer screen that floated in the air in front of her, glanced at Willa's eager elfin face, which was framed by a wild cinnamon mane that always reminded Holly of fox fur. "So," said Holly in an accent far more ancient, "you've been listening all along." "I listen," Willa protested. "But to what things? There are many things to ken in the forest besides the sound of my voice." Willa cocked her head toward the dense grove of willow trees at the edge of the meadow. "Birds, insects, wind in the leaves, water rushing over rocks," Willa offered. Holly humphed. "You still hear so little, Willa." Willa bristled. "What else is there?" "Listen," said Holly. Willa stared at the largest willow perched on the bank of the meandering stream. A section of loamy soil had eroded away, exposing a tangle of roots that reached toward the life-giving water as it burbled by, just out of reach. Willa knew that her great-grandmother had been named after the willow. The tree was also Willa's namesake, but it had taken only 4 generations for the name to evolve, as names often do, from willow to Willa. Most off-world hybrids had adopted a name from nature after the landing nearly 700 years ago, and the custom eventually crystallized into tradition. Willa. Willa's attention snapped to Holly's ice-blue eyes. "Daydreaming isn't a lesson you need to learn," Holly remarked. Willa straightened her posture. "I was thinking about how different Earth must have been before the landing, before deconstruction and restoration. Thorne told me most of the world was paved in stone." "Concrete and cement," Holly corrected. "The world wasn't exactly covered with it, but, well, it might as well have been, I suppose." Cities of concrete and steel sprawled over deforested ground, connected by a web of hard, black roads that stretched for thousands of miles in all directions. Once off-world tech was gifted to the human population and they spread out among the stars, plus with the rising sea level, it all began to change. Now, Port Paris, Port New York, Port Beijing are mere villages compared to what they once were, only 1 million or so in each. But this isn't a history lesson, little fox, and you're changing the subject. We were talking about listening to the trees. Actually, said Willa, we were talking about time. Holly smiled. So we were. Let's see what else you recall. What are the 5 levels of mastery? Willa sighed, resigned to the lesson. Everybody knows that. Cryptics, nocturnals, shapeshifters, sages and wraiths. Oh, everybody knows that, do they? Well, don't they? Willa wondered if this was one of the trick questions Holly often used to test her grasp of the lessons. The titles are obvious, Holly said. The skills that go with them, not so much. Okay, Willa nodded, accepting the challenge. Cryptics can communicate with nature, with elementals, trees, and even rocks. Nocturnals can see alternate realities and learn things about them. Shapeshifters can, well, change their shape. Sages are like the ancient human idea of wizards and witches. They can alter physical matter. And wraiths are kind of like living ghosts. Holly gazed at the tall yew trees that lined the edge of the meadow and slowly shook her head. Isn't that right? Willa said, slightly annoyed by Holly's cool demeanor. You make the skills sound like magic tricks, Holly said. They're much more than that. They require a deep understanding of the nature and structure of parallel realities, of space and time, of existence itself. Holly shifted her gaze to the sun, low in the sky. And speaking of time, let's call it a day. Holly tapped the nano-glass screen 3 times. It shrank to the size of a marble and fell into Holly's outstretched hand. She tucked it in one of the many pockets in her flowing, knee-length tunic. Willa stood and stretched in the golden sunset light, then ran to catch up to Holly as her mentor strolled across the meadow. What do you hear when you listen to the trees? Asked Willa. Stories, replied Holly. Stories of the past, the present and the future. Do the trees tell each other stories? They do, Holly nodded. In fact, they do far more than that. Holly bent down and gently caressed the caps on a patch of mushrooms growing near the base of a yew tree. The roots of every tree in the forest are connected by fungal filaments that not only deliver information, but can also be used to share food and water where needed. It's called a mycelial network. Holly stood and gazed at the forest in awe. In essence, the forest is one tree. Willa cupped her ear in the direction of the grove. I don't hear any stories, except the tall one you're telling me now. Holly smiled. Then you're listening with the wrong ears. These 2 are all I have, Willa said. On the outside, Holly said with that same enigmatic smile. You need to listen from within. Why are cryptics always so cryptic? Willa said. My job, as your mentor, isn't answer your questions, dear Willa, but to teach you how to answer them yourself. You'll do the same for your own apprentice one day. You must be eager to finish tutoring me, Willa said, slightly downcast. Why would you say that? So you can move on to become a nocturnal. That may not be my path, Holly mused. Not everyone wants or needs to master all 5 levels. I could spend a lifetime learning about nature and still not know everything about being a cryptic. They walked along the bank of the stream, listening to the rippling water as it coursed over smooth stones. Willa tried to match Holly's gliding stride without looking conspicuous. I suppose the stream has a story, too, Willa joked. Everything does, said Holly. For example, I know that, in your story, you like Thorn very much. Willa stopped dead in her tracks, thunderstruck. Holly kept walking as though she had commented on nothing more important than the weather. Willa shook off her surprise and ran to catch up. Yes, of course I like Thorn, Willa sputtered. You met him yesterday after sunset in this very grove. And the day before that and the day before that, Holly said. Willa's face blushed red as her hair. No one knows. The trees know, said Holly. You're saying the trees told you that we... Quote. Trees can tell you lots of things, Holly said, if you know how to listen. Willa locked eyes on a yew tree as they passed, scowled in suspicion at the tall tattletale. Willa and Holly walked in silence until they crested a small hill with a mass of large, gray boulders on top, 3 of which rose above the others, bestowing the name Three Rock Mountain upon the area since long before the landing. Holly and Willa strolled down the gentle slope toward the Shattuck, a spiral structure similar to Stonehenge, but fashioned from large, shimmering blocks of nano-glass. There were 10 wide gaps between the upright slabs, spanned by thick lintels. 9 of the spaces rippled with transparent rainbow hues, like oil on water. The 10th was empty, a simple passage that allowed entrance to the center of the spiral. Willa followed Holly through the entry passage. "Tomorrow, then," said Holly. Willa nodded, afraid to speak lest Holly raise the subject of Thorn again. Holly favored Willa with a reassuring smile, stepped through one of the shimmering portals and vanished. Willa exhaled with relief, but before she could step through a portal on the opposite side, her eye caught a glimpse of a fox sitting on a nearby low hill. It had a white chest, black feet and red fur that matched Willa's hair. The fox stared at Willa with intense curiosity. Willa smiled and held its gaze for several heartbeats before the fox turned and vanished in a grove of ash trees. Willa faced the Shattuck and disappeared through the portal that would transport her home. Ash Grove Cottage was more accurately described as a large, ashwood arbor that served as a scaffold for thick vines blooming with violet cathedral bells that swayed gently in the evening breeze. A soft, warm glow emanated from several luminaria globes that floated in the air inside the arbor. Rowan Ashgrove regarded his younger brother Thorn with the large, velvet-black eyes that ran in their hybrid family. Though he was only 17 and a mere 2 years older than Thorn, Rowan had worn the mantle of adulthood ever since their father, Cale Ashgrove, vanished a year ago on an exploratory mission to the Orion Nebula, the third such mission to vanish without a trace. Several of Rowan's classmates began calling the region the Orion Triangle and the name soon stuck. Had Earth been in a less enlightened age, many would have considered the Ashgrove family to be cursed due to the fact that Cale's absence mirrored the mysterious disappearance of Rowan and Thorn's mother, Celandine Ashgrove, 3 years before. "So that's where you've been going every night," Rowan said to Thorn in a fatherly tone when he learned of his secret trysts with Willa. "Do Willa's parents know?" "Willa and I haven't told them and neither will you," Thorn said. Rowan caught the hint of a nervous plea buried in Thorn's imperious tone. He would never betray his brother's trust, of course, but that didn't mean he couldn't tease him to within an inch of his impetuous young life. "Just her mother, then," Rowan said, suppressing a mischievous smile. "No." Thorn shot back. The plea was more evident this time. "I wonder what father would have thought," Rowan mused, "of one of his sons wanting to learn to be a cryptic and a nocturnal at that. We've been a family of explorers for generations. I am exploring, just not out among the stars. I think father would be proud and happy that I'm following my dream. And yet you don't want anyone to know." Rowan fixed his obsidian eyes on Thorn. "Is it your dream? Or is this more about Willa?" Thorn averted his brother's bottomless gaze. "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing," Rowan admitted. "You may be making the right choice, but is it for the right reason? The path of mastery isn't for everyone. What if it's Willa's path but not yours?" "Willa and I can still be together, Rowan." "Can you?" Rowan shot back. "Do you ken what it really means to become a cryptic, a nocturnal, a shapeshifter? A sage? What if Willa chooses to go further than that? Will you still be together if she becomes a wraith?" "That's just a myth," Thorn said. "Many myths contain a seed of truth," Rowan said. "I've heard that a sage who becomes a wraith can sometimes forget who they once were and can transform into a banshee, trapped between the world of the living and the dead." "You're holographing," Thorn said, though his confidence was beginning to waver. "I'm not saying you can't have a life together," Rowan said more gently, "just that you'd better understand what that life would be. I'm sure father, wherever he is, would be happy and proud that you're following your dream." But in Father's absence, it's my job to make sure your dream doesn't become a nightmare. Rowan selected a blue nano-glass bead from the download dimple on the countertop. He tapped it and it expanded into a tablet. Rowan did a quick check of the data, tapped the tablet again. It shrank back to a bead and Rowan headed out. "Where are you going?" Thorne asked. "To Andromeda Spaceport. We're finally starting first contact simulations tonight. In 3 years, I'll be wearing the sigil of a first contact specialist." Rowan flicked the bead in the air, caught it and tucked it in a small pocket. "Rowan?" There was a wavering tone in Thorne's voice that made him sound more like a lost child than a boy of 15. Rowan stopped and waited. "You'd never go to Orion like Father, right?" "Don't worry," Rowan said, "the triangle's been quarantined." Thorne nodded, relieved. Rowan pushed down his own sad memories and hurried out into the cool night air. Willa's family lived in a spun nano-glass spherical treehouse perched high in an ancient oak. In the early morning light, it looked like a giant, glistening cocoon. The nest, as her mother dubbed it, contained several large chambers that served as rooms, with Willa's at the very top, where she had the best view of the verdant countryside. Willa awoke to the muted drumming of a black and white great spotted woodpecker as it searched for breakfast outside her room. What was once a rare bird in Ireland now populated many of the forests and groves on the outskirts of Port Dublin. Willa tapped the frosted nano-glass wall next to her hammock. A large, transparent circle appeared in the wall and framed the woodpecker like a spotlight. Willa gazed at the bright red cap on the nape of the bird's neck that identified it as a male. The bird continued to hunt for food as Willa listened to its staccato beat. "Willa. Morning meal." Her mother's melodic voice hung in the air as the walls softly reverberated like crystal wind chimes. As Willa rose from the hammock, her gossamer blanket formed to her lithe frame and transformed into a one-piece garment that covered everything but her head, hands and feet. She placed her bare feet on the smooth, cool floor and stepped onto the spiral nano-glass staircase. The stairs instantly lowered her to the floor below like an escalator. Lily Hillycrising, Willa's mother, was dressed in a buff-colored, long side-slit caftan with pajama pants and soft brown suede cloth slippers. She didn't look a day over 30, though she was nearly twice that age. Her graphite-colored hair was woven in a long, Celtic braid that hung down her back to her trim waist. Her eyes were large, cool pools of deep lapis. Lily watered the herbs in the hydroponic garden that made up half of the small kitchen. Willa padded into the room, still half asleep, her fox fur hair tousled like a thistle top. Lily glanced over at her daughter and nodded to the hollowed-out bubble in the kitchen wall that served as the breakfast nook. "Mornin' Puka," she chimed. Lily started using the nickname ever since Willa announced her intention to become a cryptic like Holly, pukas being nature spirits that long ago bestowed the secret of shape-shifting to hybrids who were skillful enough to curry their favor. Willa also heard rumors that pukas can sometimes be difficult and mischievous creatures, which made her wonder if that was the real reason her mother had chosen the pet name. Willa sat at the table before a small plate of ripe melon slices and popped one in her mouth. The cool, sweet juice always helped her wake up. "Where's Father?" "Out collecting a few herbs, sage and leeks, mostly." Willa sat up. "Are you making mimsy soup?" "Holly said she's waiting for you at the Port Dublin Shattuck," Lily said as she tended her little garden with the greatest of care. Willa looked up from her plate. "Port Dublin? Not Three Rock?" Lily smiled. "Do you know me to be hard of hearing?" Willa bolted for the spiral staircase, which lifted her up to her room as smoothly as it had brought her down. A change of location always meant that Holly had a new adventure in store for Willa. At this point in her training, it could only mean it was time for passage, an important step on the path to becoming a full-fledged cryptic, hence the mimsy soup, which Lily only made for special occasions. Willa was back in the kitchen in less than 60 seconds, dressed in a slick cinnamon-hued nano suit and boots that perfectly matched her hair and accented her golden eyes. She kissed Lily on the cheek, snatched 2 more slices of melon from her plate and walked straight toward the curved wall of spun glass. It opened like an iris at her approach and Willa stepped out onto an enormous oak branch that wound its way down to the ground. In a flash, she was off through the grove with all the exuberance of youth. Up in the nest, Lily watched her daughter until she vanished among the trees. With a nod, the door shrank to nothing. She walked over to a luminaria sphere floating nearby, tapped it twice. Holly's face appeared like an apparition in a crystal ball. "She's on her way," said Lily. "Are you sure she's ready for passage?" "The purpose of passage is to find out if she's ready," Holly reminded her. "I ken that," said Lily, "but she's only 13. Holly fixed her ice-blue eyes on Lily. "Then she's about to grow up very quickly." Dozens of spectators were gathered around a large game court, cheering several teens that stood on 2-foot-wide hexagons of various colors that made up the playing field. A large nano-glass screen replicated the field and displayed symbols for each player. Poppy Rousseau, an intense, human girl of 13 with smooth, mocha skin, coal-black hair and deep brown eyes, stood on a white hex and studied the screen with single-minded focus. She wore a deep green jerkin and skin-tight black leggings down to her knees that left her calves and bare feet exposed. Braylon, a Shunzai alien about the same age, stood on an adjacent white hex. He wore his culture's customary silver neck ring inlaid with his family's 5-moon crest and little else. His entire body, including his long tail, was sheathed in small, delicate crimson scales. His large violet eyes blinked at Poppy. "Gold's got to appear in the grouping over there." Poppy shook her head. "No, that doesn't feel right." A gong rang out from the display speaker. The players jumped into the air all at once, some straight up, several to one side and a few sprang diagonally. The hexes shifted colors under them and they landed, some on white hexes, some on colored ones, a couple of players on black. The players who landed on black hexes moaned and left the field. Poppy, Braylon and a handful of other teens remained. Braylon pointed to a position a few hexagons away. "I'm telling you, it's a fractal progression." Poppy ignored her friend and stared at a nearby black hex. The ghost of a gold, 6-pointed star appeared in her vision. The gong sounded again. Braylon went one way as Poppy took a leap toward the black hex. The field shifted and Poppy landed. The black hex had turned into a gold star as she had envisioned. The gong repeated 6 times, announcing her as the winner. The spectators cheered as Poppy raised her arms in victory. Braylon, smack in the middle of a black hex, fixed on Poppy. He huffed through his flat nose slits, exasperated. "How do you always know?" "Women's intuition," Poppy said with a wink. "You're 13. Don't be a stick. Everyone knows that girls mature faster than boys." The crowd dispersed and the teens congratulated Poppy on her win. She caught a glimpse of Willa in the nearby field, waved goodbye to her friends and ran to catch up. "Willa, wait." Willa slowed her pace until Poppy joined her and they continued across the field together. Willa glanced back at the game court. "What's that make it, Poppy? 10 wins in a row?" Willa said. 12, Poppy said with pride. "I'm going for lucky 13 next month." "Do the other players know you cheat?" Mom says it's not cheating to use your natural ability. Sounds like something a nocturnal would say. Green-eyed? Poppy prodded with a wicked smile. Willa returned the smile. Me, jealous of you? I'll pass you soon enough. You'll be old as Holly by then. And as wise, Willa quipped. Poppy shook her dark locks. I never thought you'd be the type to go through the training. Willa stopped, taken aback. Thanks. I don't mean that in a bad way, Poppy said quickly. Just that, most of the cryptics and nocturnals I've met have sticks up their butts. Willa raised an eyebrow. What about your mother? Her most of all, Poppy said. Sticks up their butts, Willa repeated. Humans have such charming expressions. Poppy smiled. You love us. I know. What's wrong with me? The girls laughed. Holly can be frustrating sometimes, Willa said, but she's not stuck up. Maybe a little annoying. She's a cryptic. Annoying's part of the job description. Willa smiled. Then you'd make an excellent one. Poppy accepted the remark as a compliment and bowed. Thanks, but I won't be walking the rocky road to the Port Dublin Lodge anytime soon, if it's all the same to you. Besides, shapeshifters give me the creeps. Walk me far as the Shattuck? Willa said. Soul swear to come to my next game? Promise. They locked arms and headed across the field, then skirted the edge of the yew grove in silence. Your mother, Willa began, reluctant to voice her next thought. Was it difficult for her? The training? Why, because us lowly humans don't have your fancy hybrid genes. That's not what I meant, Willa said. It's okay. It is tougher for humans, which is one reason I don't mind cheating at hexes. Maybe you should join in, even the odds. Thanks, but I've got no tick for games. Now who's gotta stick up her butt? They reached the Shattuck and shared a hug. Poppy's eyes locked with Willa's. Word of advice? Human or hybrid, the training changes you. My mom's not the same person she used to be. I'd hate for you to lose yourself. Poppy's words unsettled Willa. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere, she said with false bravado as she stepped through the Shattuck portal and vanished. Chapter 2. The Black League. The Empire has cast a shadow over our lives and given birth to a great irony. That we must search within that shadow to find the light that will dispel it. Darva Val Atten, founder of the Black League. The rogue gas giant planet floated through the black expanse of space, not tethered to any star. Deep blue storms of swirling gas were driven, not by the heat of a sun, but by radiation emanating from deep within its titanic core. Orbiting the nameless giant was a coal-black moon the size of Mars. Its staggered surface was tiled with dark crystal outcroppings that reflected the dim indigo light of its parent planet. Deep within the moon, a network of chambers and tunnels had been carved in the obsidian rock that served as a secret sanctuary for the Black League, a literal underground resistance movement dedicated to overthrowing the oppressive overlords of their home world, Zos. The League had been fighting the overlords for as long as Brim could remember, and tomorrow would be the 16th anniversary of his naming. Brim had grown into a strapping young man, with the green eyes and golden-brown skin that was typical of his people. He was almost too tall to lie comfortably in his cot that, along with a work desk and a small game table and 2 folding chairs, were the rock-hewn room's only furnishings. Brim's father, Dennick, and his mother, Alara, had been members of the League for over 30 years. Brim had been born within the deepest chambers of the Dark Moon and had never set foot upon Zos, nor even seen the planet other than on the tactical screens in the central command chamber. Brim would sometimes download images of Zos onto his personal tablet and study them for hours. Scenes of the lush forests and crystal-clear seas of ancient zoos, as it was in the days of his distant ancestors, would clash against recent recon images of the dark steel towers that loomed over the stark expanse of grey stone apartment blocks that housed the downtrodden population. As foreboding as the towers were, none matched the ominous presence of the citadel, a massive steel mountain that rose from the center of Arcana, Zos's capital city. Ensconced within the citadel's peak was the Eyrie, a hive of surveillance monitors and quantum computers constantly sifting through trillions of data points per second in the relentless search for any sign of dissent or discord among the enslaved populace. Brim knew that an unspeakable beast was sequestered in the black heart of the Eyrie, its pale eyes fixed on the monitor banks, as though feeding on the streams of data that poured into the citadel all hours of the day. The beast's name was Zos Asura, the Archon of the Overlords. Even at a distance of 30 light-years, Brim felt a slight shiver of fear as he gazed at the citadel's imposing image on his tablet. After his 16th naming day, he'd be old enough to officially join the resistance and accompany his parents and other League members on their clandestine missions, most of which were extremely dangerous. Many of Brim's friends in the League had lost at least one parent in the struggle, if not both, so Brim considered himself lucky to still have a mother and father. A knock on Brim's airlock-style doors interrupted his reverie. He rose from his cot. "Come." Gar, an older man of military bearing, with close-cropped white hair and a weathered mahogany complexion, entered and plopped himself down in front of the metal tactics game board on Brim's table. He wore the dark gray tunic and pants with black, knee-high boots that was the typical garb of the Resistance. Brim's own garb was just as utilitarian. Several red, white and black hexagonal stone pieces were spread across the playing surface of the tactics board. Gar studied the layout with his one good eye. The other eye, milky white in the center of an angry crimson scar that slanted across his brow and cheek, made Brim's skin crawl whenever Gar looked at him. "Your grasp of strategy is coming along nicely. A few more lessons and you might even win a game." "Any word of my father?" Brim asked the elder soldier. "He'll be back when he's back," Gar said, never lifting his gaze from the game board. He reached out with one thick, gnarled hand and moved a red playing piece to block a white one. "There. Let's see you get out of that one." A klaxon sounded through the tunnels outside Brim's chamber, alerting everyone to the approach of a ship. Within moments, the doors parted to admit Brim's mother, Alara. Her bright green eyes matched the flight suit that blazed against her smooth, cocoa skin and straight black hair. She stood framed in the circular doorway. Gar stood at attention. "Alara," he said with a slight bow of respect. "At ease, Gar," she said and turned her attention to her son. "It's your father's ship," she said. Her voice trembled very slightly. Brim could tell she was holding her emotions in check until she knew for certain that his father had made it back alive. Brim tapped his tablet off and they all moved briskly down the corridor toward the docking bay, the three of them on pins and needles. The docking bay was a large, circular chamber surrounded by several smaller circular bays, each capable of servicing a 100-foot diameter starship. Dennick's ship, a gunmetal gray disk nicknamed the Shield, lowered into one of the bays, its gravitic drive field discharging intermittent bolts of electricity as it came into contact with the steel ribs that reinforced the bay walls. A thick airlock dome sealed overhead once the ship settled into its berth. A smaller airlock opened into the larger central chamber where Brim waited with his mother amid several others eager for news of Dennick's mission. Brim's father, a tall, lean, muscular man with mahogany skin, a shaved head and a heart-melting smile strode through the airlock in a crimson flight suit along with his flight crew. His pale, blue-green eyes locked onto Alara and Brim. Without breaking stride, he headed for them and enveloped them both in a crushing hug. He planted a kiss on Alera's full lips and another on the top of Brim's black locks. "I have a gift for you, son." He dug into a pocket and extracted a small, flat rock divided equally into a black side and a white side. He held it out to Brim, who took it, slightly puzzled. Alera was astonished. "You made it to the forge without being detected?" "I don't understand," said Brim. "It's a rock." "It's a piece of Zoe's, a piece of our home world," Dennick said with the awe and reverence usually reserved for rare gems, "a symbol of what we're fighting for. I got it for your naming day." "It's a rock," Brim repeated, doing his best to sound grateful. "Not just any rock," his father assured him. "It's from the Forge, the place where the resistance began on Zoes after the overlords arrived. Plus, it's a very rare polarity stone, perfectly split into black and white, symbolizing our struggle against the forces of darkness who've stolen our world from us." Dennick glanced at the other League members surrounding him. "Gar. Call a council meeting, I have news." Gar gave Dennick a crisp, military nod and hurried off at a pace that belied his advanced age. Dennick and Alera headed across the docking bay toward the airlock that led to the council chamber. Brim remained where he was, turning the polarity stone over in his hand, trying to feel the importance his father had placed on it. Dennick glanced back, rested his gaze on his son. "Coming, Brim?" Brim's emerald eyes snapped upward. "Me? Attend a council meeting? You're turning 16 tomorrow, or have we miscounted?" Alera teased. Brim clutched the stone in his palm and ran to join them. They passed through the airlock and led the other League members down a long corridor cross-cut with tunnels that led to several chambers. They had been laboriously carved from the black basalt of the volcanic moon with plasma beams. One of the side tunnels ended in a thick steel door outfitted with a DNA scanner, keyed only to admit Dennick and Kara Val-Aten, head of the Resistance. An extra layer of security was provided by Vodnik, an imposing guard in black armor over 6.5 feet tall, a tranquilizer rifle in his vice-like grip. Behind the door was the League's communication chamber. Not a single message was transmitted or received without Dennick's or Kara's approval, thus ensuring the League's location remained secret. The only other communicators were aboard the ships and were hardwired to transmit ship to ship or to the base and nowhere else. If anyone tampered with the circuits, the comm system would self-destruct in seconds. Brim eyed Vodnik as they passed on their way to the council meeting. He'd never been inside the communications chamber, nor would he ever enter unless he eventually rose to his father's rank of captain or took over as base commander. Brim shook the thought off because, should that ever happen, it would most likely mean his father and mother were infirm, severely injured or even dead. Alera looked back at her son. "Let's not keep the council waiting." Brim realized his pace had slowed and he hurried to catch up to the others. Zoes Asura stood on the balcony of his eyrie on the uppermost level of the citadel. His pale, alien eyes scanned the surrounding city of Arcana, a monotonous patchwork of dull stone and steel cloisters that stretched to the horizon in all directions, punctuated here and there by tall, black sentry towers manned by ever-vigilant security drones. His pallid gray skin was stretched tight over a cadaverous frame that stood over 6.5 feet tall, held together by an iron will more than by mere muscle and bone. He was dressed in titanium military armor rather than the black tunic, leggings and knee-high boots favored by the overlords under his command. Zoes Asura believed it was his duty, as Archon, to present nothing less than a powerful and unwavering image to the populace, lest they perceive any hint of weakness in those that ruled over them. Constant vigilance, to ensure that order was maintained in the face of the threat posed by the resistance, was a small price to pay for the nearly limitless power the overlords wielded for the past 1,000 years. However, Zos Asura was no idealist. He knew full well that every Archon that had come before him and everyone that would come after would face dissent from a small but vocal minority. The Black League, despite their frustrating talent for remaining hidden, was still just a minor annoyance in the long history of the Overlord's rule. The planet Zos was the center of an ever-expanding empire, presently in control of the wealth and resources of 20 worlds within a 100 light-year sphere. Those worlds, and the subjects upon them, had been hard-won, annexed by the Empire slowly over time, often after long, bloody battles that took a heavy toll on ships and resources, not to mention the cost of growing thousands of new biosynthetic soldiers in the genetic tanks. But now, a gift from the Elder Gods had been placed in Zos Asura's hands, along with an opportunity to expand the Archon's reach far beyond the present borders of the Empire. Strangers from over 1,000 light-years away, possessing a powerful, previously unimagined technology, had been captured by a sentry patrol. Their ship had been damaged by the Maelstrom, a swirling anomaly of violent electromagnetic storms and ever-shifting gravity waves that formed the farthest border of the Empire and could tear a starship apart in seconds. Only the strangers' advanced technology had saved them from annihilation. The crew and their crippled ship had drifted between the stars of the Empire for a year, their supplies nearly depleted, before being found and transported to the Citadel. Granted, the survivors had been reluctant to divulge the secrets of their tech to the overlords, but Zos Asura's interrogators were particularly persuasive. As the Archon gazed out over Arcana, he knew it was only a matter of time before his legion of scientists adapted the strangers' tech to their own ships, allowing them to cross the Maelstrom intact, and traverse the 1,300 light-years to the planet the strangers called Earth. Capturing such a prize and vastly extending the borders of the Empire would consolidate Zos Asura's prestige and power in ways no overlord had before, thus cementing his rule and rendering him impervious to the power-hungry machinations of the other overlords who constantly plotted to usurp his throne. However, ruling such a vast empire wouldn't be easy. The Archon knew he'd have to rely on a few trusted overlords, one most of all, to maintain order across the light-years between Zos and Earth. Zos Asura had been grooming that overlord for years for just such a task. He knew it would be foolish to assume his protégé was without ambition or beyond plotting her own rise to power and would have to make sure his bribe was sufficient to buy her unwavering loyalty. Dennick stood before the League Council as Alara, Brim and Gar sat in the stone amphitheater that surrounded him. The domed chamber and the tiered gallery were hollowed out of the moon's black basalt heart and lit with glowing blue-white crystals embedded in the chamber walls. Presiding over the meeting on a raised dais was an elderly woman whose mahogany skin was in stark contrast to long, snow-white hair wrapped in multiple braids. This was Kara Val Aten, the daughter of the League's long-dead founder, Darva Val Aten. Though her green eyes burned with the vibrancy of youth, Kara was over 150. "Your plan is risky, Dennick," Kara said. "The risk is far greater if we don't mount a rescue," Dennick responded. "Our spies say the prisoners are from outside the Empire. That they possess technology far more advanced than ours. That tech is already in the Archon's grip. We need to know how to combat it, and to do that, we need to rescue one of the captives." Kara nodded at Dennick's logic. "Then you have the Council's blessing. Assemble your crew. We will be free in this life or the next." Dennick repeated the oath. "We will be free in this life or the next, I so swear." The meeting broke up and, as Dennick and Alara headed back up the entry corridor, Brim was right on their heels. "I want to volunteer." Dennick and Alara stopped and pulled Brim into a side tunnel. I appreciate your resolve, son, but just because you're old enough to attend council meetings doesn't mean you're ready to go on missions. Especially not one as dangerous as this, Dennick said. How else am I supposed to learn? Brim protested. I agree that experience is the best teacher, Alara said. But without proper training, your first experience could be your last. Brim leaned against the rock wall, crossed his arms and sulked. Dennick and Alara exchanged a glance. I'll make you a deal, Dennick said. I'll ask Gar to accelerate your training while we're gone, and you can go on the next mission that doesn't involve a trip to Zoes or any of the Empire's security outposts. You mean a supply run? Brim grumped. A mission's a mission, Alara said in the tone that Brim had learned from long experience meant his mother would brook no further dissent. Brim nodded and Dennick placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Every mission, no matter how small, is vital to the survival of the Resistance, Brim. We're never more than 10 orbits away from starvation, his mother reminded him. Every member of the League must do his or her part if we're to survive. Brim let the harsh reality sink in and managed a weak smile. I promise to make you proud. Dennick smiled and ruffled Brim's hair as Alara wrapped him in heartfelt hug. We already are, my son. Chapter 3. Port Dublin. Strangely, after the landing, it took much longer for humans to accept the hybrids into their society than it took to accept the Grey beings, who we sometimes refer to as Welks, or other extraterrestrials. For all their inherent xenophobia, humans were far more suspicious of the half-human hybrids that could blend in among them than of the alien beings who clearly stood out. Excerpt from A Hybrid History by Holly Cotton. Port Dublin straddled the wide river that was once known as the Grand Canal, a narrow channel that, hundreds of years ago, transported boats from the inland villages to the sea. Long before deconstruction and restoration, the oceans had slowly risen due to a warming global climate, inundating all coastal cities. While enormous numbers of the population moved farther inland, many remained to rebuild their homes into multi-level villages anchored to the remaining island clusters, with connecting bridges and wide walkways high above the surface of the sea. Willa and Holly strolled across the broad Marrowbone Bridge amid the daily throng of hybrids, humans and aliens that populated the coastal village. Living in far country, interacting mostly with family and friends, Willa was a bit overwhelmed by the melange of alien races that populated Port Dublin. A Welk glanced at Willa with its large, black eyes as it passed. The odd nickname was bestowed on the diminutive aliens by the locals due to the similarity of their grey skin to the large, local sea snail of the same name. 3 amphibious nomos from the Sirius star system, looking a bit like slick-skinned salamanders, were hunkered around a table on the shady veranda of the Stargazer Inn, flexing their feathery gills, sipping water and awaiting cooler temperatures. Even other hybrids similar to Willa and Holly were a mix of traits that hinted at more exotic alien genes somewhere in the family lineage. Here and there, a human would stand out among the interstellar inhabitants. As Willa had learned, even they were an ancient genetic recipe composed of indigenous hominids and a long-lost race of extraterrestrials called the Anu that visited Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago. Isn't the lodge in the other direction? Where are we going? Willa prodded. As far as we need to, answered Holly in typical cryptic fashion. Willa sighed with mild exasperation and figured she'd know soon enough. She continued to gaze at the fascinating denizens of Port Dublin. A being at the far end of the bridge caught Willa's eye. A being so odd, so unusual, it reduced the potpourri of alien beings around it to a single race by comparison. It stood at least 8 feet tall. Its muscled body was covered with smooth brown and gray fur like a sea otter, except for its broad face, the palms of its enormous hands and the soles of its huge feet. The creature possessed a prominent brow ridge, deep-set brown eyes and flaring, leonine nostrils. It ignored the unabashed stares from all other beings that skirted around the behemoth and fixed Willa with its unwavering gaze. Willa discreetly tugged on Holly's sleeve. "What is that?" Holly glanced at the being. "Ah, there he is. That's Argus, your new mentor." Willa gaped. "My what?" "I'm still your sponsor," Holly explained, "but different mentors will guide you at each level of your apprenticeship. Argus is a Divinorum master. He can teach you how to open your senses to a larger world than can be seen with your eyes." Willa couldn't take her eyes off Argus. "I've never seen anyone like him." "Argus's people are ancient and known by many names," Holly said. "Almas, Narkuna, the Old Ones, Yeti, Susquehannock, but most used to call them Sasquatch in the days before the landing. They're the natural people of the Earth who evolved from the early hominids not altered by extraterrestrial genes." Holly and Willa stood before Argus, who lowered his intense gaze to meet theirs. Holly bowed her head in greeting. Argus did the same, then waited until Willa caught on that she was to follow suit. Willa bowed and Argus responded in kind. Without a word, Argus turned and, in 3 giant strides, stepped off the end of the bridge onto a wide, wooden walkway that led to the northern lodge, a large, 3-story timbered hall anchored by a massive stone chimney that rose above the slate-shingled roof. The lodge was used exclusively by the local quorum of cryptics, nocturnals, shapeshifters and sages for social gatherings and important meetings, although it rarely hosted all members of the quorum at once. The Sasquatch, also a quorum member, ducked under the heavy crossbeam of the high entry doors. Holly and Willa followed him inside. A great fire roared under a huge copper cauldron in the giant hearth. A thick, brown liquid bubbled in the cauldron and filled the room with a pungent aroma that wrinkled Willa's nose. An intricate, circular Celtic design ringed with 5 symbols, a triangle, a wavy line, an arch, a circle and a dot, was inlaid in the wooden floor in the center of the great room. Argus made a point of walking around it as he crossed to the far wall and disappeared into an anteroom. Willa pointed to the symbols. "What are those?" "They symbolize the 5 levels of mastery," Holly said. "Land, sea, sky, space and spirit, representing the cryptics, nocturnals, shapeshifters, sages and wraiths." Holly stood by the crackling fire and inhaled the steam that rose from the bubbling brew. She wrinkled her nose and nodded her approval. "Good batch. Very potent." Willa sniffed at it and recoiled. "That's a manky stench." "I hope that's not lunch," Willa said with mild disgust. "No," Holly said, "that's divinorum. It's used in sacred rituals. Argus is a master brewer. You're lucky to have him. My mentor wasn't so good at it. I couldn't hold down any food for 3 days." Willa blanched. "You mean I'm supposed to drink that?" "It's essential to the rite of passage if you wish to become a cryptic." "What does it do?" "It opens doors deep within the mind," Holly said. "Doors to other realms that can't be unlocked any other way." For the first time since her training began, Willa wondered if she'd chosen the right path in life. She'd heard stories, mostly vague snippets and hints, about the mysterious rituals of the nocturnals and shapeshifters, but had always assumed learning to be a cryptic was more about studies and maybe a few meditation exercises. It was one thing to sit in the woods by the stream at 3 Rock, listening to Holly's lessons on time, space, parallel realities and other esoteric concepts that Willa found fascinating. Even Holly's tall tales about talking trees were preferable to ingesting some foul-smelling, Mind-altering brew cooked up by a mysterious, furry giant. Maybe I should talk to my parents first, Willa offered. They know, Holly assured her. I explained the ritual to them before I took you on as my apprentice. Why wasn't I told? Willa asked, trying not to sound hurt. Part of being a cryptic is to expect the unexpected. Part of being a mentor is to see how you respond to the unexpected. Argus ducked under the anteroom door as he strode back into the great room. He carried a small, golden cup that looked like a thimble in his gigantic hand. Argus looked at Willa and pointed to the ornate ring in the floor. Argus, show, you go, the Sasquatch grumbled in a voice that grated like gravel. Willa glanced at Holly, who nodded her assurance at Argus's instruction. Argus repeated his gesture. Willa walked over and sat dead center in the circle. Argus carefully dipped the cup into the steaming brew and handed it to Willa. One sip only. Willa glanced at the huge cauldron, then at the diminutive cup in her hands. All that for this? You're not the only apprentice going through passage today, Holly commented. Just the first. Willa stared at the brown liquid in her cup. What if I don't pass the test? Not everyone's cut out to be a cryptic. There's no shame in taking another path, Holly said. She sat on the floor on one side of the hearth. Argus set his huge bulk down on the other side. They both closed their eyes and sank into silent mediation. Willa looked at them, a pair of wildly mismatched bookends. She took a deep breath of courage and brought the golden cup to her lips. She sipped the divinorum, winced at the taste and gently placed the cup on the floor. Willa closed her eyes and waited for the unexpected.